I've given you this quote of A.W. Tozer before. He once wrote this: "Apart from Christ, let nothing dazzle you. Apart from Christ, let nothing dazzle you." I've been thinking for a while of where to go next for our Tuesday Bible study, and I toyed with a few things for a while, but last week I became settled very much on the book of Hebrews. The Christian life is very much a battle. How can we best be sustained week after week? Well, by looking to Christ, by always looking to Him, by letting nothing impress us or dazzle us as much as Him. What will keep us going? Loving Him more than anything else in this world. And that is very much the burden of this epistle to the Hebrews. What is the book about? The theme of the book is the supremacy of Jesus. The theme of the book is Jesus is better. And so today, briefly, I just want to introduce the book. Who wrote this epistle? Some suggest it was written by the Apostle Paul. Paul wrote an epistle to Timothy, and Timothy is mentioned in chapter 13. So chapter 13 and verse 23 says, "You should know that our brother Timothy has been released, with whom I shall see you if he comes soon." So perhaps that sounds a little like Paul. Also, there are some themes in this epistle that also appear in the epistles that we know are written by Paul. Perhaps too, this epistle was included in the New Testament canon because some considered Paul to be the author. However, there's much to suggest that this epistle was not written by Paul. For example, Paul always begins with a greeting where he introduces himself. There's no greeting here where Paul identifies himself as the writer. Also, scholars point out there's a difference in the Greek. Paul writes in the epistles we know to be his, Paul writes in a common Greek compared to the kind of Greek we find here in Hebrews. But also consider chapter 2 and verse 3. "How shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? It was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard." Whoever this writer was, he says he received his message of this great salvation from those who first heard it from Jesus. Now, Paul in his epistles always says the opposite. Paul always argues that his apostleship came from the fact that he was one who had met the risen Jesus. He'd received his message directly from Christ and not from the other apostles. In Galatians, he wrote this, Galatians 1 verse 12, "For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ." And so it seems we don't really know who wrote this epistle. It seems it wasn't an apostle, so it wasn't Paul, but certainly we find the teaching here in line with apostolic teaching. Who then was the apostle written to? In our Bibles, we know the book as Hebrews. That title isn't part of the Greek text, but we know from our reading it that the letter was written to Jewish Christians. Was it written specifically to Jews living in Palestine, in Jerusalem or Judea? Well, it's worth noting that when the writer of Hebrews quotes from the Old Testament, which he does a lot in this book, he always quotes from the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And that Greek translation was generally used by Jews living elsewhere in the Roman Empire. Lending support to that view is what the writer says again in chapter 2 and verse 3. So chapter 2 and verse 3 again, he writes, "How shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? It was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard." And so he says this great salvation was declared by the Lord, and then it was attested to us by those who heard. In other words, we weren't there when the Lord said these things, but we've heard about these things by those who were there. So it seems the Jewish Christians that this epistle was written to, they were not in Palestine, they were not in Judea, they were not in Jerusalem, they were elsewhere. Adding to that, in chapter 12 and verse 4, the writer says, "In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood." It seems the writer was writing to Christians who lived somewhere where there had been no persecution that had resulted in bloodshed. Well, persecution resulting in bloodshed had been the case very early on for the church in Jerusalem. And so it seems this letter was written to Jewish Christians living elsewhere, perhaps in Rome. In chapter 13 and verse 24, the writer says, "Greet all your leaders and all the saints, those who from Italy send you greetings." One writer says this about that verse: "Those who come from Italy" is most naturally interpreted not of people who at the time of writing are living in Italy, but of Italian people who are resident in some other part of the world. So it might be that the writer sends his letter to Rome and sends greetings along with it from Italians living abroad, living away from Rome and away from Italy. Today, as we just introduced this book, I want us to notice that this is a letter. It's an epistle. It is a book of Christian doctrine. It is full of important and vital theology, and we'll consider it. But think about this today. It is written from a pastoral heart. In chapter 13, this is how the writer describes his letter. So chapter 13 and verse 22, he says, "I appeal to you, brothers, bear with my word of exhortation, for I have written to you briefly." How does he describe his letter? He calls it his word of exhortation. "I appeal to you, brothers, bear with my word of exhortation." This letter has been his encouragement to them to keep going, his urging of them to keep going. Don't give up from following Jesus. Press on. Look to Christ. We'll see in this epistle that there are some who have forsaken Christ and gone back to Judaism. But he is saying, keep going. Don't give up. Look to Christ. Keep hold of Christ. There is no salvation outside of him. This letter was a sermon written to these people. If it is the case that this letter was written to Rome, but it was written at a time when chapter 12 and verse 4, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood, then that means this letter was written before the days of the Roman Emperor Nero, who would shed the blood of Christians. He would crucify them and use them as torches for his gardens to light the night sky. Although these Christians haven't got to the blood-shedding days of Nero yet, we know from chapter 10 that they had suffered. Chapter 10, verses 32 to 34. "But recall the former days when, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one." So before Nero, in AD 49, Christians in Rome had suffered under the Roman Emperor Claudius. Persecution under Claudius did not involve bloodshed, but it did involve imprisonment and the loss of property, as described there in chapter 10. And so it may well be the case that this epistle was written at a time when there had been persecution, but there was worse to come. And so what did this pastor give to these people? He gave them Christ. Let nothing dazzle you but Christ. Keep looking to Christ. Might it be that we are living in a time when there is some persecution, but like Christians living in Rome between AD 49, the time of Claudius, and the AD 60s, the reign of Nero, there was worse to come. Might it be for us? There is worse to come. Let us be aware of the times. Are you taking stock of what's going on? Billionaires who live in California, those who have benefited from the revolution of what is social media, they are the ones deciding what is true and acceptable. When we first went into lockdown, we celebrated our new reach, the gospel getting out beyond the four walls of our chapel building. But might our presence on such platforms be short-lived? And in a world that is hostile to the gospel, are you going to persevere? What do you need to keep going? You need what this writer gives you here. You need nothing to dazzle you but Christ. You need to know that he is with you. You need to know that his heart is for his people. In chapter 7, the writer tells us that the Lord Jesus Christ is with us. I mentioned this on Sunday, chapter 7, verse 25. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Christ's intercession in that verse is something that he is always doing. His work for us as his people continues. So I've been recommending a book to you last Tuesday and on Sunday as well, the book Gentle and Lowly. And in that book, the writer gives an illustration in regard to Christ's intercession. Have you ever seen a glider? At least one member of Hebron has experience of flying gliders. How do gliders work? Well, a plane takes the glider up and then the plane releases the glider. Dane Ortland in his book gives the illustration of a glider being carried by a plane. We are the glider, Christ is the plane. Except Christ never lets go. He never lets us go. He continues to carry us all the way to heaven. There is much in this book of Hebrews of Christ. There is much to ponder. His intercession is but one example. Dane Ortland writes, "What if you heard Jesus praying aloud for you in the next room? Few things would calm us more deeply. In the battle, in the clamour of this world, keep looking to Christ."